Good evening and welcome to Seniors Alive. I'll be your host tonight, Paul Minicucci. Now normally I'm the host of Nevada County Interviews and Judith Bruce Mello is your host on Seniors Alive. And I'm hosting it tonight for a very special reason because Judith is our guest tonight. Judith, welcome to your own program.
Thank you.
And tonight we're going to be talking about a personal journey that Judith went through, and both in terms of going to England, but also a personal journey in terms of you becoming an ordained minister. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, can we get a little background on you? Because I know as a host, often you don't get to talk about yourself. Where did you grow up around these parts?
I grew up in Colorado, in Grand Junction, Colorado, and went to college and graduate school in Minnesota. Graduated from University of Minnesota with a PhD in 1976, and actually had moved out here to Reno in the Grass Valley, Nevada City area in 73. Mm-hmm. I actually discovered Nevada City in a book that I was reading in Minnesota. And as soon as I got my job and settled in Reno, I came over here and fell in love with it way back then.
As everyone does. So now you have a PhD in psychology, is that right?
Educational psychology.
And you have used that degree before, I know, but also you have sort of migrated into gerontology and geriatric studies. Is that
yes, so working with older adults. And so the story tonight that we're going to be talking about with the Cambridge experience describes how I kind of got off onto a new career path in 1991 when I was traveling in Cambridge, and how that ended up causing me to go for seminary education and ordained ministry. And then after 10 years of working in the ministry, visiting sick and dying people, we spun off my ministry into a nonprofit working with older adults, and that's when I was with Senior New Ways and when we first started running the programs on NCTV.
Well, great. Thanks for that history. Now, this should stand as a warning to anyone that when you're going abroad, you never know what will happen. So we have a series of slides, and of course we did mention this show is called Return to Cambridge, A Spiritual Journey. So let's start in with the slides. So Judith, you are over in England on a holiday and found yourself where?
Yeah, okay, well, the people that I went with are showing on the screen right now. This is Sir Richard and Lady Neelam Feacham of Alameda, California. But Neelam is an old friend of mine before she was married to Richard. He is director of the Global Health Program at University of California, San Francisco, and was knighted in 2007 for his lifetime of work in global health care. They invited me to come with them to Bury St. Edmunds, which is very near Cambridge, this last September, in just a few months ago, for his sister's 40th wedding anniversary. So that's how this trip happened, and thanks to them. So let's, on the, I should just say a little bit more about the Global Fund. When he was with the United Nations in Geneva, I got to visit them there too. And that Global Fund went from scratch, because he was the founding director, to now having projects in 136 countries.
Wow.
So he's very accomplished. I couldn't believe all of his degrees when I looked on the website. Right. So let's take a look at the next slide then. There we go. This is the first stop for me after we landed in Bury St. Edmunds. I mean, the plane didn't land there, but our car landed here in Bury St. Edmunds, which is where St. Edmund is buried. That's how they got the name. And St. Edmund was a martyr who died in about 890. And we're going to see the abbey that's established there and the gardens in a few moments. But this was actually the first part of the spiritual pilgrimage, was spending time in Bury St. Edmunds. Not only was it kind of a family event, and I love my little room here that's showing on the screen, but it was a very spiritual time. You know, I knew I was going to be going to Cambridge, but this got me off to a good start, and going through the Abbey was very interesting.
And how was it spiritual? Give us a little background. What did you feel and see?
Well, being in the Abbey there, which goes back so far, was something that just was a very spiritual feeling and got me. So let's take a look at the next slide here. That is the Abbey then in the background, and the gardens are a beautiful community area. There's actually a place there where children can play on slides and things. And so let's go on to the next slide then. Okay, so I was there for 3 days and then went to Cambridge as part of my spiritual experience. And this is, of course, kind of the picture of King's College Chapel, which was finished after 69 years of being built in 1515, actually under Henry VIII. So Cambridge was the place that I had this experience in 1991 of being called into the ministry.
Can I ask you a question about Cambridge? You probably know the answer, but what is special about Cambridge? It has special status in England, of course.
Yeah, well, it was established it started out in 1209 when people from Oxford, students, fled the riots that were taking place in Oxford. And so the college actually was begun with one school called Peterhouse in 1284. That was the first college. But now there are 31 colleges there. Many, many famous people have been there. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Coleridge, A.A. Milne, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, and all these famous people that discovered DNA. You know, so many famous people, some monarchs, some prime ministers went to Cambridge.
Right. So, so you were spending time in this in the Abbey, and tell us a little bit about how you. What was the nature of the revelation?
My experience.
Your
Okay,
experience.
So in 1991, I was traveling in Cambridge for the first time. I didn't know anything about it, and I was on the Cam River in a little boat. And we were asking our punt driver questions about his time there as a theology student. And he said, well, if you're interested in theology, you should talk to my advisor, Brian Hebblethwaite, who was the dean of Queen's College. And just at that moment, he looked up on the bank and he said, my goodness, there's Brian now. And he paddled over and he said, I have some prospective students for you. Well, I knew nothing about Cambridge, but I knew I was the one that would be talking to him. And in the process there in his office in 1991 of talking, not why I wanted to come to Cambridge, because I didn't know anything about Cambridge, but why I wanted to get back into the field of religion, which I had done a little bit of in the 70s. I realized I really did. I wanted to leave my field of educational psychology and go into the ministry.
Right.
But,
and I know you mentioned to me that you were interested primarily in Eastern religions?
At that time, I was interested in Eastern religion. Mm-hmm.
Now, do we have the slides of this?
So in a minute we do. The one slide that just showed first sec was King's College Chapel windows, of course, very famous windows there. Yeah, let's stick with that. There are 26 of those windows that tell stories from the Old and New Testament, and all that stained glass was removed during World War II so that it wouldn't get bombed. So now let's go on to the next, because this is the next slide is perfect for showing you where my pilgrimage began. That's the Anchor Pub on the Silver Street Bridge in Cambridge, and that is where we had lunch right before catching the pub in 1991. And you'll see pictures at the end of the show of the Little Cam River and the punts that we were on. So there we are. Then let's have the next picture, because I want to. The next slide will show you something of the St. John's College. So I had this experience. Well, let's hold this slide for a while. I had this experience in 1991, and it took me a long time to figure out what to do with this calling and how to fulfill it. But finally, I did, and I became a minister and so on. And so now I'm back there again, and I didn't really spend too much time this time at Queen's College, which is where I had this experience. This time, I had the privilege of getting a private tour by a former dean of St. John's College. And this is the beautiful old library at St. John's College, built in the 1600s. And it is full of leather-bound books with that beautiful stained glass at the end.
Right.
So
Very beautiful.
we have several pictures here of St. John's College of these most exquisite rooms that I was very impressed with and hadn't expected that at all. But the man that took me through the college was, he is an Old Testament scholar. So the whole time I was getting my tour, we had this wonderful conversation going. He is Richard's brother-in-law. You know, it's sort of confusing, but a distant relation.
Now, without taking too much time, because I know we have a lot of slides to go through on your journey, can you tell us a little bit about what distinguishes one college from the other? St. John's is distinguished by, is it by subject matter or
No,
who
it's
founds it?
not. It isn't. In fact, that's the exact question I asked when in 1991 I was getting on the punt, and that's how we found out our punt driver was a religion. No, it tends to be more tradition, family tradition. Some of the colleges are stronger in certain areas, but really it isn't divided by subject matter at all. And I'm still kind of learning, you know. Now this picture here, Paul, is the beautiful combination room, which is where many famous things have happened. For one thing, that room is where Eisenhower planned some of the D-Day landings. It's the dining room at St. John's College where faculty eat when the students aren't there. And it is considered to be one of the most beautiful rooms in the whole university. King Charles proposed to Queen Henrietta Maria, forging a bond between England and France, you know, years ago. Fascinating.
Well, now, with regard to your particular experience in calling, was the setting at all intimidating to you, that you would be, in some sense, coming into the mainstream of religion, you know, with this very old tradition?
That's what is so amazing, is that since I was totally unprepared, and, you know, it's just amazing that I would end up in the Dean of Queens College office talking about why I wanted to not come to Cambridge, because I didn't know anything about it at the time, but why I wanted to go into religion. I mean,
Right.
it's just, I didn't seem to be intimidated. I mean, it was quite an amazing spiritual
So
experience.
you felt naturally attracted to it, and that was part of the impetus to...
It felt completely natural and normal, and that's why, even though it meant my life completely turned upside down at the time, because I had to make a lot of financial sacrifices and break up with my sailboat boyfriend and all this stuff, it always felt like it was the right thing.
Great.
Yeah.
So we can go continue
Yeah.
the next slide.
Let's see the next slide here. Okay, so good. We're now to the very heart of this experience, this spiritual journey. This is a day trip that I took out of my time at Cambridge. I went up to Norwich, where St. Julian of Norwich was for 50 years in this church. This little church is St. Julian's Church. It's different from the cathedral, and there is a statue to her at the Cathedral of Norwich, but this is her little church. And she is probably the first woman author of a book in English. She lived from 1342 to 1429. She had an amazing positive outlook on God and religion. She is the one who said, "All is well, and all is well, and all manner of things shall be well." She did not believe that God was a God of wrath, and she also had a view of God and Christ as mother. And she came to this understanding during a deathly illness when she was 30 years old, and she had 16 visions, all within May 8th. She had 16 visions. And then she wrote them up in a book called Revelations of Divine Love. First a short text and then a long text. So if we have the next slide, you can see the view from the church into her cell. So this is a cell that Julian was in for 50 years as an anchorite. It's one reason the church probably didn't give her too much trouble with these different views. if you see the window looking out of the cell, she was able to be kind of a spiritual director for the community at a time during the Black Death and the burning of witches. So it was not a happy time, it was a dark time.
Right.
But she had this wonderful philosophy, and if we have the next picture, you'll see on the next slide a close-up of the window where she looked out to the community and was able to provide spiritual nurturing. And then the next slide is looking, it's the altar that's in her little cell now. Of course, it looked like more of an apartment when she was there.
Right.
And she had a maid, always a maid, who would help her because she was anchored there, anchorite. She was
Right.
in the cell. The next slide shows a little bit of the window into the church at the top. Well, it's not even looking, you can't even see it in the way it's showing up on the camera now, but right above this altar is a window into the church where she could see what was going on in the church and receive communion once a month.
Right.
But that's where she was for
So
over 50
do you know
years.
what is the history of anchorite person that was their mortification for Christ is to
Well,
stay in one place?
A mortification. I haven't ever heard that term used with anchorites. It's more a person being called a contemplative prayer. Mm-hmm. And they are supported by the church, as was her maid even. One reason we know the names of the maids she had is that money was left to her in people's wills. Sarah and Alice were the two maids. Mm-hmm. But she just chose, some people think she was widowed in the Black Death, and so decided to become a contemplative in this
Right.
cell. Mm-hmm.
Takes a lot of courage and spiritual awareness to,
It does.
to do that.
But I love her philosophy. And anybody interested in Julian can look on the internet under friendsofjulian.org.uk and find out more about St. Julian of Norwich, one of the really great mystics, women mystics of Europe.
All right. So now we have the next slide. Are we finished?
Yes, I think we're pretty much done. I was able, by the way, to sit in that cell for an hour and a half just by myself because most of the tourists go to the cathedral.
Right.
And but I knew that this is how it was because I had a teacher about Julian, and she said that the church is very quiet.
So you knew the history of St. Julian before you actually
I
visited?
did, yeah. This was really, in a way, the pilgrimage was to Cambridge, but the heart of the pilgrimage was even to Norwich.
Well, let me break from the slides for a second. What was the impetus for you doing the pilgrimage in the first place?
This year, you mean?
Well, so those slides were from your...
These slides are from what we
recent-
call a revisit back
Yes.
to the
All
place
right.
where
Okay.
this calling experience in '91 happened. That trip was just for pleasure with a couple other close friends of mine, Ron and Rika Hauserman, and we just were going through Cambridge,
Right.
as part of the touristy thing to do.
All right. You just never know.
You never know what's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay,
So
so-
let's have the next slide then. And this is where I am now in London. We only had 2 nights and 3 days in London, but I hooked back up with Richard and Neelam. They had been doing some health kinds of things down in the south of England, so I was on my own in Cambridge. And because Richard is a member of the British Travelers Club, which is right on Pall Mall, or Pall Mall is really how it's pronounced, I was able to stay there right in the heart of London. So the morning I got there, I walked over to Westminster Abbey. If you'll show the next slide, we can see another view of the British Travelers Club. This club was established in 1819 as a place where people from all over the world, ambassadors and so on, stay. So I stayed up in the 5th floor, and it was just elegant surroundings there. And you think of all the history. Of course, they didn't allow women to stay there for a long time.
Right.
But while I was waiting to hook up with Neil and Richard, I went to Westminster Abbey in the morning, and part of this spiritual experience of the whole trip that I totally didn't expect was that if you show the next slide, it's of Westminster Abbey from the inside garden. Oops, sorry. Just let's stay with this slide right here. I'll come to it in a second. When I was in the Abbey, the saint that is buried in the abbey, Saint Edward the Confessor, has at 11 a.m. every morning an opening of the shrine to St. Edward, and people from all over the world get to go up to St. Edward's shrine and pray. And I just happened to be standing right by his shrine when they had this 11 a.m. thing, which I didn't even know about. So, I mean, it was just another coincidence for me as part of the spiritual experience. Now, on my way over to Westminster Abbey, I went by this adorable little bird keeper's cottage in St. James Park. So Pell Mell and the British Travelers Club is right next to St. James Park, which is bordered by 3 palaces: Buckingham Palace, St. James Palace, and Westminster Palace. And this little bird keeper's cottage was established there when the park was opened by Charles II, who loved this park. And there's always been a position for the bird keeper.
So it was during the Restoration?
Yeah.
And so a bird keeper, that's really interesting.
A bird keeper, and there was a beautiful little garden there, too, as you can see.
Right. You have to love British tradition.
Yeah, which I do.
Yeah.
So the next slide should then show Westminster Abbey from the inside. And, you know, the Abbey itself was extremely inspiring because there are many, many famous people buried there, and 17 monarchs are buried there. It has had daily worship since the early times, but it was really started on this site in 960 by the Benedictine monks, so it goes way, way back. But during the war, they had to cover up all those graves and vaults and things with 60,000 sandbags to keep from damage happening. You know, and it's the Coronation Church, of course, Westminster Abbey. Since the death of Edward the Confessor, 1066 is when it became the Coronation Church. So some of the coronation stones and stuff, they had to hide, or they had to take it out to the country where they hid a lot of things.
1066, the invasion of William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
It's an interesting.
It's a big date.
Yes.
Yeah. That was the date that Edward the Confessor died. So, you know, it was totally unexpected. And other things that we did in London, if we have the next slide, this, I think the title of this section is called Earthly Pleasures.
Right.
And I must say that being with Neelam and Richard in London was really quite a high time. Neelam and I went walking at Buckingham Palace, where Richard was knighted in 2007. We didn't go in, but we were walking around the town, and that night we went to Mamma Mia, the stage play, after having a wonderful dinner at a wonderful restaurant. And then the next day, we had the opportunity to go to Hurlingham Gardens, which is a famous old club there. We have a long waiting list to get into, be a member of the club, but a friend of a friend was able to get us there. And then that evening, we went to St. Martin's in the Fields for Vespers. So, you know, let's have the next slide. It was quite a high time. This is one of the pubs we went to there. I love the pubs and the British, the way the British are in the pubs, you know, kind of let down their hair. This is the Red Lion pub, just off Crown Passage and Pall Mall. Has the second oldest beer license in London.
Yeah, and that's, I know literary figures have met there often during the history of. So, is that the last of the slides?
Let's see. Is that the last of the slides? I think the very last slide is a picture of Neelam and me at the Sheridan Park Lane, which is where she stayed and where we had a lovely time reminiscing and catching up on what we had done that week.
So, after you've gone back to the journey, what has it meant to you in the last couple of months to reflect on it?
What sticks with me, in spite of all of the wonderful experiences in London with the kind of more touristy things in London, I keep going in my mind back to that cell in Julian's church in Norwich, and just the philosophy that she had during that dark time, you know, that that love was God's meaning overall, and that there is no wrath in God. And she even looked at sin as just errors and our needing to learn better. She really did not look at humans as evil.
Which I would imagine helps you in your ministry with sick and dying people. That philosophy, no doubt, lifts you and the patients.
Yes, and of course now more doing the work with the active seniors, I think having an upbeat philosophy of life like she did, even in those times, is helpful.
Right. It's quite a inspiration to have a woman of those ages to rise to such importance and prominence. It wasn't often that was occurring. I often think
it's
that those
quite
women,
amazing.
Yeah, were some of the most interesting people in the world. So we have about a minute left now. What's next coming with Seniors Alive? Do you have anything planned coming up? Do you know?
Well, of course, our show for this next month will be with Barbara Schaefer, who has a sled dog company, Alaskan Siberian Huskies. We're going to have the dogs on the show, and she'll talk about her book and her trips and all sorts of interesting things.
So do watch while Seniors Alive goes to the dogs. And it's been my pleasure to sit in for you, and you've been a great guest on your own show.
Thank you.
And I know it takes a lot of courage to be able to talk about a personal thing like your journey. So that's about all we have time for this evening with Judith Bruce Mello, who will be hosting Seniors Alive next time you see us. For Paul Minicucci, I'm saying goodbye-bye.